It's the Misfits.
Hey everyone, welcome back to Ministry Misfits. We are on episode 3, season 3, perfect trifecta here. Unfortunately, Andrew and I are back remote still again for this episode. I'm recovering.
Yeah, we discovered that it was much more than just the flu that I had. Not COVID, luckily, but so one more trip in the remote studio here, and then we should be back next week. Yes. Although we said that last week also, so who knows where we're going to be at any given time. But we are on the right episode count at least, so that would deserve applause if I remember to hook the soundboard up. So yay!
Perfect. And also, if you haven't seen yet, we did release some brand new merch, kind of featuring a retro 90s look with a cassette tape. We've got our Paul with his Ministry Misfits hat on a couple different things as well that you can purchase. So go over to the website ministrymisfits.com. Check out the button there for the new merch that is available on the website that you can purchase. Also, some of the other merch that was available on the website is still available at a lower price. So Check out the newer merch and also our existing.
Yeah, I was able to go in and I found that there was an option for, I don't even know what the option was, but for some reason it lowered the price by a few dollars on almost all of the different items. We left the Tikva items at the same price because that just means we can give more money to Tikva. But a lot of the other items, the price for the items have gone down a little bit. I believe now all mugs are about $15. And then all of the different t-shirts and stuff are around 15 or 18, something like that. So if you want to go check that out, go check that out. We also will have an updated link for you. If you want to just see the new items, you can go to ministrymisfits.com/new. There's a bunch of different things like that we got going on. And there's some other updates that are coming. I finally was able, the one advantage of being sick the past 2 weeks was that I was finally able to get the merchandise updated. So we're doing this one step at a time here. But today we have a little bit of a heavy discussion we have to walk through. And we say have to just because of the fact I'm tired of seeing this conversation being so poorly handled online. And not just online, from the pulpit in a lot of cases as well. We are going to divide today's episode up intentionally into 2 parts because one part is super sensitive and we have to get that correct. The other is much more politically motivated, but it's off of the first part. And so we want to make sure that is addressed correctly also. But we want to make sure that both of them are addressed theologically and that we take our time to do both of them separately so that way we can make sure that we actually start seeing this done well. That being said, the order we're doing this is intentional because both conversations have to be had and in their proper times and orders. And we are saying this, we haven't even introduced the topic and we already are saying why we're doing it this way. Ecclesiastes 3. Brandon, do you have any idea what that passage is dealing with? This is a famous one out of Ecclesiastes.
Is this the one where there's like a time and a place for everything?
Yeah. In everything, there's a time and season, a time to dance, a time to mourn, right?
Mm-hmm.
That's Ecclesiastes 3. Everything has its place. Everything has its proper timing. And so we need to make sure that we are discerning the proper times. This is also part of the reason why we're doing it this week rather than doing it last week, where we saw a lot of these responses. So we are going to start today talking about tragedy and theology. And when we say tragedy, we are talking about tragic events that are happening, whether it's a personal tragedy in someone's life, or if it's a national tragedy, a community tragedy, an international tragedy, tragedy in general. So a tragic event at any level is what we are actually dealing with. And when we talk about that, we don't have, well, I didn't pull up Webster's. I don't know if you did.
No, I was surprised. I was waiting for a Webster's
Right.
definition for tragedy. I can get one for us though.
Well, the way that we're using it is we're talking about an idea of a tragedy would be a tragic event that will produce trauma. This isn't just like, oh, a tragedy looking at the Cleveland Browns the past 16 years. That's not what we're talking about with tragedy, even though it is. We are talking about a personal tragedy that will bring about trauma, a community tragedy that will bring about trauma for a community, a international, a national, whatever level it is, it's going to bring about trauma with it. It's inescapable. It's just part of the human
Mhm.
condition is that when tragedy comes, trauma follows. And when those events happen, we see a lot of different responses. Most of the time with good intentions. Not always. Most of the time with good intentions. And that is one thing that we want to make clear. We understand that even when we see the bad responses, oftentimes it's done with good intent.
Yeah, and I think that's people's hearts are in the right spot, but the
Right.
person on the receiving end doesn't see it that way.
Right. And that is why we are wanting to make sure we address these sort of things. So some of the different things we see a lot of, thoughts and prayers is always at the top of the list. It also is at the top of the list of being made fun of, but it's at
Yes.
the top of the list. Jeremiah 29:11 getting misused over and over and over just needs to stop. Even if you're using it in good intentions, just stop. Please stop. The the gut instinct to prophetically declare victory over a situation done with good intentions, the gut instinct to deliver prophetic doom, if you're doing so thinking that you're going to be convicting somebody, you're probably doing it with good intentions. Although most of the time, again, seeing this bad intentions, if you don't believe me, just read the book of Job. You'll see it a lot. Anger is a big one. It's an initial reaction to tragedy. You want something to have to be held accountable.
Yeah, you want justice.
Justice. Outrage over the lack of justice is another big response you see immediately. Blame, that's immediately thrown out. We don't even know what has happened, and yet we are already blaming something for causing this. A big one that needs to stop in any situation regarding anything is targeted evangelism of now we have an opportunity to reach these people while they're down.
Yeah, but while
That's
they're
got to
vulnerable.
stop.
Yeah.
Yeah, that's got to stop in general. Just saying, don't do that. All of these different things, again, most of the time out of good intentions, most of these are coming from religious people, not even necessarily all Christian. This is coming from different places. Good intentions, wanting to help. But the problem is there's actually only one correct theological response to tragedy. And it's one that we do not see very often, especially post 2016. I have really not seen this done well as a whole by the church in the US. That correct response would be empathy.
Hmm.
Empathy meaning understanding and participating in the grief of the person that you are trying to help.
I was just going to say of why it's not done well. I think we don't see good models of it, and we continue to
Right.
see the same repetition of the list that you mentioned of you go on social media and something tragic happens and all you see is comments saying thoughts and prayers. So the more we see that, it becomes ingrained to us of like, oh, that needs to be my response too, versus how do I actually sit in this versus just sending off my response that feels like I checked a box off, to say I did a good deed, that they
Right.
know they've been heard, but being heard and seen are kind of two different things.
Well, and thoughts and prayers is part of empathy if you're actually doing that.
Yeah.
But just commenting that on a Facebook post does not actually mean that you're going to do it. And most people are under the impression that you putting that means that you're not actually going to do it. What we mean when we're talking empathy, as far as it being the theologically correct response, we see it. There's 5 or 6 passages specifically that we want to pull out as to why we're saying this is the correct response. One of these is Romans 12. This is where Paul talks about the idea of mourning with those who mourn. It's not enough just to say, "Oh, you're hurting. I'm so sorry for you." It's a you are hurting and I hurt for you.
Mm-hmm.
This is what, again, we just talked about this in Ecclesiastes 3. There is a time to mourn. And we should mourn with those who mourn. Weep with those who weep. Because we love to rejoice with those who rejoice. We love the good praise report. We love the good, party after a baptism. We love the potlucks. We need to also learn to love to mourn with those who mourn.
I forget if I've
Philippians
shared
2.
this on here, or at least in person. I know for myself on like a personal reflection, I've recently learned that empathy is challenging for me from a distance. So if
Yes,
I'm in direct conversation with the person, and probably that's part of a human touch too, of being able to see and
right.
understand and have conversation with them, I can be more empathetic. But if I get a simple text message of something, it almost feels disconnected and it's harder for me to be empathetic. Not that I shouldn't, but it's just more, I've realized it's more challenging for myself.
Oh, definitely. Again, we're talking about this from a theological correct response, but part of this is that this is part of a discipleship response as well. It's done best in person, in personal relationship. This is part of why, I said 2016. Part of it, again, we saw examples of people trying to say empathy was now a sin. Even though we just read multiple, we've only gotten one verse into our list here, and we've already seen an example of the fact that it's literally part of what we are commanded to do as believers. But the idea of empathy being a sin was what was put out, and then you add in the fact that we are now in a social media age, an age where we are hearing about tragedy, in some cases, the moment they happen across the world. That connection point is broken in a lot of places. Not that you can't have real relationship online. We know we can have real relationship online. That is not up for debate. You can have real relationship and real accountability and real discipleship over the internet, even over Messenger. But the problem comes when we lose sight of the fact that it's an image bearer that is hurting on the other side, on the other screen, and not
Mhm.
just another bot. This actually is part of what we see in Philippians 2, the idea of we are bearing each other's burdens. It's a burden. We said what we're talking about here when we talk about tragedy is something that is bringing about trauma. We are helping somebody bear the load that they are now has been laid on them. Galatians 6 is saying the same sort of thing. Luke 10, we just talked about this story going into Holy Week, right? Lazarus dies. Jesus
Mm-hmm.
shows up, and when Martha comes to him, what does she do?
She basically pleads with him of why didn't you come earlier? She's angry at him.
If you had been here, my brother wouldn't have died. She's blaming Jesus for this death. And how does Jesus respond?
Well, I'm trying to think because he has tech. I'm
Yeah, there's two
not remembering his
responses.
initial response, but I was gonna say he has two responses on how he answers back to both Mary and Martha. There of
The first
one,
response, yeah, go ahead. The first
I
response
was
is
gonna
what?
is of weeping, or is that the
No,
second
that's
one?
his second response. His first
Okay.
response to the sisters is like, no, your brother's not actually dead. He'll be back. And that is somewhat comforting because it's Jesus saying it. And the sister's response is, well, yeah, I know in the second coming, he will rise. And then Jesus sees the people weeping. And the fact that the people are so distraught that all they can think about is the fact that we have to wait until the end to be able to see him again. And it causes him to break down and weep as well. He knows he's about to raise Lazarus. But death is there. Destruction is there. And a lack of hope is there. And it causes Jesus to weep along with them. We see this, or sorry, that's actually John 11. My bad, not Luke 10. But yeah, Luke 10, Good Samaritan, right? What's the story of the
Mm-hmm.
Good Samaritan?
Basically, we have. Let's see, what's their Levite and
We've got a priest, we've
what's the
got a
other
city
guy?
official
What's the Samaritan? Yeah,
walking down the road, and what do they see?
they see a man laying on the side of the road who needs help, and everybody basically continues to pass him by because it's not culturally appropriate to help the man typically, or they just don't have the time to or the resources.
And then who shows up?
A Samaritan.
And he does what?
He decides to help him, brings him into an inn, and basically has his wounds and bandages healed, or have somebody paid to have them healed, and then also tells the innkeeper basically anything else he needs, put it on my tab.
He pays for all of it, picks the man up, takes him into town, and he treats the man as if it's himself. Literally, in the fact that he puts it on his own bill. He's literally, in this case, bearing another person's burdens. And all of this is wrapped up in the idea of John, what we see in John 13, which is the idea of we are to be defined by our love. The love of Christ, which is all empathy because he comes from a high place to become like us and to bear our burdens to the cross.
Mm-hmm.
That is how people are to know we are his disciples, is to love like him, which requires us to do this. We're not called to provide empty or heavy hope, even though, again, good intentions, bad results. We're not required or called to provide empty or heavy answers. We as humans want to see quick fixes. We don't like problems. We cause a lot of them, but we don't like them. We don't have to have an answer for everything. We want to
Mm-hmm.
provide an answer. We don't have to. Sometimes the correct answer in the midst of tragedy is, I don't know. That is the correct answer. And we may never know is the correct answer, even though you're like, well, that's not going to help. That provides no hope. That provides no promise of salvation. That provides no promise of resurrection. Again, we saw this in with Lazarus. The only reason that the idea of, yes, your brother will rise again was helpful was that because it was coming from Jesus himself.
Mm-hmm.
It was coming from the resurrection. Coming from another broken human who everybody knows is a broken human is not going to be helpful in the moment.
Yeah, and I think it's kind of funny too, a little bit different scenario, but in Daniel with Nebuchadnezzar, how he's
Right.
asking for revel of somebody to reveal
Revelation,
his
yeah.
dreams. Yes, thank you, of his dreams for him, and so he's looking for answers on what it is, and bringing in the magistrates and astrologists and everybody to get him an answer. And it's kind of funny. I feel like that Daniel's the one that interprets it for him, but it's not an answer that typically someone would. It's got to it, even though it's the correct answer that God had revealed to Daniel. Um, but he was just
And
looking
Daniel
and kind
even
of
tells
throwing out
him,
anything for somebody to give him what he wants.
right. And Daniel even tells him, you don't want this answer. Like, you don't want me to answer this question for you. And yet he goes ahead and does it. But even there, it was the correct answer from the Spirit when it was asked by the king. Daniel doesn't just barge in and offer it. And he doesn't even offer it the first time he's asked. Because the first time he's asked for an answer,
True.
he says, give me a night to fast and pray. Like, if you are earnestly wanting an answer from God, then we need to take the time. Because again, there's a time and a place for everything. Because what happens when we just immediately respond in the midst of tragedy is that we have emotionalism rather than empathy. Everyone has emotions going on in these sort of situations. That's part of why Jesus has to wait to come in. He knows his human side, his emotions would want to just heal Lazarus right there and prevent him from suffering. But that was not what he was supposed to do. Lazarus had to die so that Jesus could bring him back. And that's not an answer that the family would want, because we saw what happened when he tried to give them that answer. They didn't understand it, and they were only okay with it because they trusted Jesus. Which
Mm-hmm.
again goes into what we said before with the empathy of the fact that this needs to be done at a personal relationship level. Mary and Martha trusted Jesus. Jesus had the connection already with Mary and Martha. He doesn't do these sort of mind games, even though it's not a mind game. It was all done with a purpose, with Jairus and his daughter. It's just like, hey, guess what? Your daughter's back. She's alive. Just go home and hug her. He didn't have the same relationship with Jairus he has with Mary and Martha. And so he treats them differently because of the fact that he knows them and he is there for them and not there for himself.
Yeah, he knows exactly what they need.
And he knows exactly what they need, which that's the other thing. We as humans don't necessarily know what they need. We're not God. But what we do know is that if we allow ourselves to empathize with them and actually hear them and see them both, like you had said, both of these things, not just one, then we will be able to find out what they do need from us. And sometimes that's just to be there and not say anything.
Mm-hmm.
A couple other things we are not called to do in the midst of tragedy. We are not called to blame the victims or blame the cause. We don't need to blame anything in the midst of tragedy. Tragedy happens because we are still in a fallen world. That's all we can be 100% sure about. Is that there will be tragedy because of the fact that there is sin. we don't need to immediately find someone to blame. We need to immediately find somebody that is hurting. And we are not called to weaponize Scripture one way or another. We don't need to take Scripture and apply it to something that we don't even know what's going on or what is needed. Whether that's weaponizing in a way that you think is going to comfort the victims, whether that's weaponizing in a way that you think is going to bring about action to prevent this thing from happening again, we don't need to weaponize Scripture at all. We talked about this in episode 1 of season 3. Scripture, it does not need to be weaponized. It's already a weapon that's too dangerous for us to wield by ourselves anyway. And in the midst of tragedy, when we are responding, that is not what is needed to begin with. What is needed is for us to be there and to hear and to see. Doing this, empathy is part of what we are called to do by loving God and loving others. We are loving God through empathy because it's not trying to claim anything on God's behalf.
Yeah.
That's part of the issue that we see is people try to say they are speaking for God and they intend, and again, good intentions, but they're blasphemous intentions.
Mm-hmm.
We should not try to claim God's understanding or God's sovereignty in these sort of situations. Because we don't know. We don't know if this was just something where God is saying, oh yeah, it's just time. Or if this is a result of somebody else's choices that God has just allowed to happen. We don't know.
No.
And we won't know. And again, the correct answer to that is that's okay.
Yeah, which is not the response or answer that people will always want, but that doesn't mean that we have to give them the answer they want.
Right. We're not called to give them an answer. We're just called to be there with them. Again, going back to Job. Job was asking a lot of hypothetical questions that his friends assumed were ones he actually wanted answers from, that they were the only ones that could give it to him. And all it did was it made things worse for both Job and in the long run for them. Because they got embarrassed by Job. And then they got called to the carpet by God. Not a good combination. It's not a good day for anybody. It's loving God because it recognizes, again, that this is how he responds to us, right? John chapter 1, the word becomes flesh to dwell among us. John 11, we already said, Jesus weeps with us. The entirety of the book of Hebrews is talking about the fact that Christ humbled himself down to our level. That he is now a great high priest who is able to empathize with us in all areas. He was tempted in every way and came out, so he understands what we deal with. He experienced death itself firsthand and defeated it, so that way he is able to comfort us in that. He experienced extreme hunger and thirst in the desert, and yet he overcame it, and so he can understand why we are coming to him asking for our daily bread. Empathy is part of loving God because it acknowledges a part of who God is.
Mm-hmm.
And then it obviously is loving our neighbor because we are literally loving our neighbor. Right?
That's one of the easiest ways to.
Yeah. Empathy is loving our neighbor, and it is putting them first, putting their needs first, putting their thoughts first, putting their words first, putting their feelings first, everything. It is all about them and nothing about us, other than the fact that we are putting ourselves with them. That is what the response of a believer should look like in the midst of tragedy. Good intentions, bad results is what we see most of the time. Because we want to do more. We don't like hurting. And so this is an action of not only humility, but trust in the fact that God does know what he's doing. You know, all these things that we tell people that are hurting, we need to actually be telling ourselves.
Yeah.
God does know what he's doing, and so I just need to be there. I don't need to provide the answers because God is going to do that when God sees it fit to do so. I don't have to find the victim because, again, God will make all things right. And so if I really believe what I'm telling this person that they should be believing, then my responsibility is just to be there and not say anything. That is what it should look like. Now, there's another side to this whole discussion. And that is what we are going to dive into after this break.
We'll be right back.
Today's a great day to start your own podcast. Whether you're looking for a new marketing channel, have a message you want to share with the world, or just think it would be fun to have your own talk show, podcasting is an easy, inexpensive, and fun way to expand your online reach.
Buzzsprout is hands down the easiest and best way to launch, promote, and track your podcast. Your show can be online listened on all major platforms within minutes of finishing your first recording. We just switched to Buzzsprout for Season 2 and have immediately noticed the difference.
With Buzzsprout, you get a great-looking podcast website, audio players that you can drop into your websites, detailed analytics to see how people are listening, tools to promote your episodes, and more. Podcasting isn't hard when you have the right partners, and Buzzsprout and the Misfits want to help you get started.
Contact us for a free consultation call, and then visit our affiliate link to get started with Buzzsprout. Using this link not only helps support the Misfits, but it also gets you a $20 Amazon gift card. The teams at Buzzsprout and Ministry Misfits are passionate about helping you succeed. Join over 100,000 podcasters already using Buzzsprout to get their message out to the world. To find out more, go to www.ministrymisfits.com/affiliates.
We're back.
Everybody, welcome back. Andrew and I are beginning our episode 3, season 3, kicking it off here.
You almost forgot what episode we were on again, didn't you?
No, I knew today was mixed in with the 3, so we're good. But today we're talking about what tragedy looks like and how we're called to respond to it as Christians. And before the break, we talked about our response should be from a place of empathy and what that truly looks like to feel and be with somebody else and feel their pain and sit in that with them and not specifically be called to provide an answer. And we discussed partially through that from John 11, where we see Jesus' response to Mary from the death of Lazarus, and then also towards the end of loving our neighbor, of what that looks like, and truly the root of empathy there, of putting others' needs first before our own and thinking of others highly above ourselves. But now, switching gears, we're going to be getting into a little more of the real life political side of this and some true ramifications.
Yeah, because empathy is the one we said this at the beginning as well. Empathy is something that should be done on a personal level and with someone that you have relationship with. Somebody that is coming to you wanting comfort is somebody that is going to be coming to you because they trust you. They feel that you are safe to talk to about all of this. And so that should be our response in the midst of tragedy. Because again, Ecclesiastes 3, there's a time and a place for all of this. That should be the initial response. But eventually, the time comes for action as well. So we need to have this discussion as well as believers. And we need to make sure we have it biblically and that it's done through Christocentric theology, not Cold War theology. Because unfortunately, what we have heard about this specific discussion, the majority of the time, at least that we've been alive in the US, it's been coming through Cold War theology and not a Christocentric biblical theology. Just this morning, I saw somebody arguing again the Cold War theology side of this. Well-known pastor online. We've got to get this right. But we have to get it right after we have already done the empathy. And the empathy will actually inform us on how to best do this. Because again, we've talked about the fact that empathy is the reality of we are actually hearing the people that are hurting, not just responding emotionally to something that has gone on.
Yeah. And I think the bigger reason why you're saying this is the call to do it is if we don't look any different than the world around us and how we respond.
Right.
And it's a bigger call now to look more Christ-like, to show it be the hands and feet of what Jesus's love looks like.
Exactly. And like we said, it's an example of what Christ has done for us. It is he put us ahead of himself, and he did not consider equality of God to be something to be grasped. And so instead he lowered himself down, becoming flesh to become like us. And so now he is able to empathize with our weaknesses and our hurts and our desires and everything else. And so because of that, he is able to provide us with the solution. He's God. He can provide us with the solution anyway. But how much better is it for us to know that the person that's providing us with the solution actually has walked with us through it?
Mm-hmm.
We talked about some of the things we're about to discuss within the political response to all of this. We talked about it in a lot of our episodes of season 2. Biblical justice with Joash Thomas, the rights and responsibilities for believers. We talked about in our Christian ethics discussion. We talked about within our Christian nationalism discussion. We talked about within the Hindu nationalism discussion with Prudy Ray. A lot of these things we have covered in more detail in those episodes. So if we say something in passing that you're like, wait, I want to hear more, it's probably coming from one of those. So go listen to all of them. Now, Christians should. This is the first thing that we want to make sure we are clear about. We just talked about the fact that within empathy in our response to tragedy that we should be, seen, not heard, felt, not heard, and we should be listening instead of speaking. That is for a time, and that is for a season, and that is for being done in personal relationship with others. But we as Christians have a responsibility to speak out against injustice and preventable harm. Preventable harm meaning things like hunger, things like homelessness, things like brutality, whether that's police, whether that's government, whether that's employer, whether that's education, whether that's domestic abuse, whether that's sexual abuse, brutality of any kind. Exploitation of any kind. Again, whether that is government, whether that is work, whether that is slavery, whether that is within a marriage, whether that is within a parent-child relationship, whether that's within a coach relationship, whatever that might be, exploitation needs to be called out. Discrimination of any kind is an injustice of any kind that needs to be called out. Any loss of life needs to be mourned, and there needs to be empathy involved. Anything involving, we would call it healthcare, but the idea of preventable harm through medical attention, I guess would be the way to say it.
Yeah, part of that could be
discrimination. That is not able to be accessed is what we're talking about as far as an injustice and a preventable harm.
And I think the other important thing to keep in mind with this, as well as you said, there is a time and a place to speak out. But I think a lot of people in these spaces, they feel like because it's a hot topic thing or because it's relevant currently, that they need to have a response, or they need to create their own biblical response and act out upon it. Where sometimes people just aren't well equipped. There needs to
Right.
be a time to learn and research and get the history background on some things sometimes before you go out and give a response, because again, as we've said before, you might be doing more damage than good, especially depending upon what your reasoning is of how, which we'll get into, of how we should be speaking out to these injustices.
And that's what I'm sure there are going to be multiple people that are accusing us of doing that very thing right now. That's not what we're doing right now. We've done the research. There have been multiple times that I wanted to do this episode in the past, but we waited. Because again, there's a time and a season for everything. The reason we are doing this episode right now is that the amount of good intention, bad result posts are becoming more and more frequent and doing more and more damage. And so now is the time for us to be doing this. Because again, we are called to do this. We are called to speak out against injustice and preventable harm after and informed by doing the empathy that we talked about at the beginning of the episode first. If you have not had personal relationship and personal conversation or personal dealings with these sort of things before, the first question is why? Why have you not dealt with these things personally? Because that means that you don't have relationship with somebody that is dealing with any of these sort of things. I'm sure everybody has somebody that they are able to go to talk with about things like hunger or housing dilemmas, or that have been victims of brutality or exploitation or discrimination, or that has dealt with loss of life, or that struggles with how to find health care. Because if you don't have somebody in your life dealing with those things, then you need to get out more. Just saying, you've got to get out more. Because if your church does not have somebody within it that has at least come through this sort of thing, or not just necessarily going through it right now, then is your church actually out in its community? Everybody should be able to find somebody that they're able to sit down and have these kind of discussions with, as far as what can I do for you? Not what can you do for me so that way now I can go out and have this discussion. Because again, that's not empathy. That's exploitation.
Yeah. And the other thing that people try to, I feel like why we disqualify ourselves is why I can't relate. So if I can't relate, then I can't step in. So, and again, that's the other different thing about being empathetic, is that doesn't call you to relate or have the same story, or say, I know what you're going through. It just calls us to be there and sit and know a little bit of what they're experiencing.
And it allows us to connect with people at a level that we normally don't get to, especially those of us that are men. We normally don't get to this kind of an emotional level on a regular basis in conversation with other people. But in the situations we talked about at the beginning, in situations like we had in the list of things that we need to be calling out and speaking out against, there's no way to avoid it. Healthily. There's no way to avoid it. There are plenty of ways to avoid it, but those are not healthy ways of doing it. And so we've got to be ready and willing to just be awkward for a while. Some of us are better at being awkward than others, but we've got to be ready to be awkward for a while and allow these kind of conversations to happen. Because if you haven't had these conversations, then like we said, speaking out may not be what you need to be doing. If it means being awkward for a little bit, it's worth being awkward for. because eventually it never stops being awkward, but it gets less awkward the more you do it. I guess is the nice way of saying it. Going back into why we are calling these things out is because of, again, what we are called to be seeking. We talked about this a lot in the rights and responsibilities one. We should be seeking the prosperity of the city, not our own prosperity. This is out of Jeremiah 29, verse 7. You seek the prosperity of the city that you are in. We are called to love our neighbors and our enemies, both of them. Which means that if our enemies are hurting, then we should be speaking out against it. If our neighbors are hurting, we should be empathetic with them and sit with them and then speak out with them. We are called to put others' needs ahead and others' interests ahead of our own at all times. We are last on the list. That's it, last. Others' needs, others' interests always should go ahead of ours. That is the call of a disciple.
Mm-hmm.
We should not be seeking our own kingdoms. We should not be seeking detriment of any kind to anybody. We should not be seeking injustice of any kind to anybody. And we definitely should not be seeking death or harm of any kind on anybody. Now, what we are not addressing here is we are not necessarily talking about the just war stuff that we talked about when we did ethics.
Mm-hmm.
War is its own discussion. It brings about tragedy, it brings about trauma. But it unfortunately is a different category of tragedy and trauma. It doesn't mean that we don't speak out against it. It doesn't mean that we are not empathetic with our soldiers or with their families or with the people, with our enemies. It doesn't mean we don't do that. But the conversation, unfortunately, there's nuance. It has to be had a little bit differently. Because sometimes war is done as a way to speak out against injustice and preventable harm.
Mm-hmm.
And so there's a lot more nuance going on with that. That is not necessarily what we are talking about right here. But we should not be seeking death or harm of any kind, which is part of just war theory. If you're only going to war for death and harm, then you are not the good guy. That's just the way it is. You're not the good guy.
Savior mentality.
Right. Now, knowing that that is what a biblical call looks like, that we should be speaking out against injustice and preventable harms, that we should be seeking the prosperity of the city, love of neighbor, love of enemies, putting others ahead, not seeking our own kingdom, not seeking detriment or injustice or death or harm, that does not mean that we are all going to come to the same political conclusions. And that's the first part of this whole thing that makes this very, very difficult to have a discussion in the context of a democratic or a republic country where we all get to vote on how things happen, supposedly. Let's have that way. We'll throw a bone to the conspiracy theorists. Supposedly, we have a say. It's a little bit harder when we are supposedly the ones in charge of making the decisions to be able to say we should have a biblical approach to this when we're going to come to different conclusions. But it's okay that we come to different conclusions. That's what we see in Romans 12:18. And we talked about this in our agree to disagree episode as well. Romans 12:18 tells us that if it is at all possible, live at peace with everyone. Sometimes it's not possible to be at peace. We will have disagreement. And that's okay. As long as we can agree to disagree. Because again, what we're talking about here is the political response, not the theological one. The theological response, we should not be coming to a disagreement about. It should be very easy for us to see that theologically, in response to tragedy with another person, our responsibility is to sit with them and mourn. Theologically, what we do know and that we should be able to agree on is that we should be speaking out against injustice and preventable harm. And that what we should be seeking and what we should not be seeking, That we should be able to agree on, but the conclusion that we draw from that politically may not look the same.
Yeah, and part of that goes back to our personal lived experiences.
Right.
As we said earlier, if you haven't experienced some of those, you just may have not had those relationships or been in that environment, or that could be your whole story of you lived through all of those injustices and problems, and so you're going to have a different perspective and shaping of your personal life and the perspective that you see the world in. And so that's where the conclusions can look differently. But our call as Christians is still the same.
And the thing that is, that we have to remember about all of this, even though, again, thanks to the wonders of social media, we don't at least act like we believe this, is that our political conclusions doesn't impact our salvation. Because
Hmm.
if politics can't save you, politics can't damn you either. That's just the reality of it. If it can't save you, there's no reason that it's also going to be the thing that makes God say, "No, I don't want you anymore." With the exception of the fact that it does show us your heart. And we're going to give an example of what we mean by that. Going into the current hot topic within this whole thing around guns in the United States. What is argued, and when we say it shows us your heart, what is argued about the Second Amendment is that it's a biblical right and that it's the most important right, and so you can't be a Christian unless you defend it. That shows us your heart. That guns are in place of God up at the top.
Hmm.
That your rights as an American are up at the top. And that if you are saying this, then you are saying that you do not care about the lives of people that have been lost. There is no empathy. That is what we mean when we talk about it being at the heart. And it gets more complicated when we look at what it actually means in Scripture as far as related to the Second Amendment, as to why we are saying that what the claim about this is wrong. Because again, the argument is that it's a biblical right. Because there's self-defense laws and distinct self-defense laws in the Old Testament. There are. That is a 100% true statement. God made provision for people that had accidentally killed someone in an accident. God made provisions for people that had killed somebody in defense of their own life. It was not murder. There was a price to pay, but it was not your own life. And then the other argument, though, is that Luke 22, Jesus confirms the Second Amendment. That is not correct in any conceivable fashion. Because what we have in Luke 22, which we just did these stories a couple weeks ago leading up to Easter, right? Luke 22, Jesus tells his disciples the time is near. And he says, if you don't have a sword, go sell your cloak and buy one. And so the argument that is used is, oh, see, Jesus supports the right to carry. But they stop a verse short because Jesus actually explains to us why. He says, go buy yourself a sword. The scripture must be fulfilled that he was counted among the rebels.
Mm.
If the disciples are unarmed and Jesus is just standing in the garden with his disciples praying in the middle of the night, you're not going to be able to execute somebody on rebellion against Rome if they're unarmed praying in the middle of a garden. But if they're armed in a garden at night praying, now you have at least probable cause to say these guys are trying to overthrow the empire because he claims to be the king of the Jews.
Mm-hmm.
And look, he carries an army with him. Even if it's an exaggerated army, they have 2 swords. That is what we actually know from the text that Luke 22 actually talks about. It is not talking about your right to carry anything. It's about the fact that Christ was committed to fulfilling the scriptures. when we have these discussions and we want to try to talk about, well, the Bible defends this right. Let's actually look at it for a second, because again, this shows the heart of the matter. My biblical argument is that the Second Amendment actually is antithetical to what Christ shows us in the Gospels. Because the Second Amendment, for those that are not American or those that failed civics class, which seems to be a lot of people when you talk to them about what's going on, the Second Amendment is the idea of a well-armed militia is crucial to the security of a free state. That's paraphrased, but that's what it says. It's about citizens being able to defend themselves against tyranny. They literally just finished fighting a war against a tyrannical government, and they were able to because they had a well-funded militia. And so the idea of infringing upon someone's right to carry a weapon was a direct line to tyranny, is the idea. Now, what we see in Matthew 26, this is the story of Jesus being arrested in the garden. We just did this story a couple weeks ago at Easter. He is being arrested by a tyrannical ruling class unjustly. This is literally the exact scenario that is laid out in the Second Amendment. You carry arms to defend yourself against a tyrannical ruling class. Peter grabs his weapon poorly because he, instead of taking out a guard, he cuts the ear off of a servant. But he does so in defense of his friend that was about to be unjustly arrested by a tyrannical government.
Mm-hmm.
And what does Jesus say?
Put away the sword.
Because if you take it, you'll die by it. We have a biblical example of what the Second Amendment and use of force is all supposed to be about. And Jesus doesn't just say, no, we don't do that. He condemns the very action of touching a weapon. If we look at the Greek, the touching of it is much more of what Jesus is saying here. That's not a good argument for the Second Amendment being a crucial right for Christians to be holding to.
No, it's not a biblical truth.
There's no biblical truth in it at all. Because the actual idea of it is condemned by Jesus himself because of the fact that doing so will bring about the same kind of death to you. The issue that we run into when we have these kind of discussions about, well, we can't give up our weapons because now we are defenseless. We can't do such and such a thing because it violates my rights. And my rights are God-given. The issue at that point is that you have elevated your political views over Christ. You have elevated your political views over your neighbors and your neighbors' well-being. And that leads to abusive theologies. Cold War theology, Christian nationalism especially. It doesn't matter how many people are dying from this sort of thing. I want to have the right to do this because it makes me feel more powerful. It makes me feel like I'm in control.
I also think for people, it's a protection of, and so if it's somebody is going to take something from me, then I need to defend it. And it goes back to what we've talked about before of, well, if it's not ours to begin with, if it's truly God's, then we have an idol in place. We're holding on to something that we're placing more valuable before God in our hearts, but then also before a human life.
Well, and what does Jesus say? If somebody demands something of you, give it to them double.
Mm-hmm.
Don't stand there and defend it. Give it to them double. Because it's not about the stuff. It's about living the way that Christ has asked us to live as disciples. And so when we are going to have discussions about a political response to these sort of tragedies, we have to make sure that we are actually discussing things biblically, theologically, and not our own political ideals or our own wants or needs, because it's not about us. It's about the prosperity of the city and the prosperity of the people that are in the city that we are called to serve. So if I have to vote on something that is detrimental to me, but that allows the family across the street to be able to afford their groceries next month, then the biblical vote is for that family and not for my own.
Yeah, and again, going back to the experiences, for some, this might be their experience of growing up where guns or the Second Amendment is second nature in a way. And so that can again be something that brings should be brought to the table and have conversations with people that aren't like-minded to see what that looks like, and again go back to some of the injustices that may be from this and open up the conversation further, because you said it's truly at our heart posture. So instead of just sitting on this and this is how it's been, this is how it always should be, and this is just something I want to hold on to because I like it, well, that's not a good enough reason for God.
Right. It's definitely not a good enough reason for God. When we elevate our views, our wants over people, over Jesus, we end up looking like we hate our neighbors, not love them. We definitely end up hating our enemies instead of loving our enemies. You can't get to a point of loving your enemies when your views and your wants and needs are at the top, because your enemies stay your enemies at that point. And we end up potentially missing Jesus all the way. Because again, we're not saying that if you support the Second Amendment, you are not a believer. That's not at all what we're saying.
Mm-mm.
Because again, your political views don't damn you, just like they don't save you, unless you have made your political views a part of the gospel, in which case you don't actually have the gospel at all. What you have is a Cold War theology mindset of where your Americanness is more important than your Christian mindset. It's about being a good American, not about Christ at the center. And so, to sum all of this up as we close out here, when tragedy strikes a community, empathy is the answer. Have the one-sided conversations where you say nothing and they say everything. Learn from them. Weep with those who weep. Mourn with those who mourn. You don't have to provide any answers. You're not expected to provide any answers. And even when people are asking you for answers, they probably don't actually want the answer. It's probably just they need to ask it out loud.
Mm-hmm.
Empathy is the answer when tragedy strikes. And when the time does come for us to speak out against the harm and injustice, we need to do so. And when we do so, we need to make sure that we are putting people over our politics. That is what we need to be seeing among the church when tragedy strikes. And if we want to claim a biblical response to something, we need to make sure that we actually are looking at the Bible and looking at the story of Scripture and the message that God has given us, and not just looking for a way to justify our own wants and needs. Because
Yeah, I
justifying
think
our
that's a
own wants and needs is not a biblical response at all.
yeah, I think a lot of people will take their situation and try to tailor the Bible towards it
Right.
or make it work with their situation versus taking scripture or what Jesus says and using that to instruct our lives. We reverse
Right.
it.
Right. Which is part of what we've been talking about in our Bible study even, right? The whole
Mm-hmm.
idea that, Paul is telling the Galatians, why are you adding all this extra stuff that has nothing to do with you? He's telling the Judaizers, why were you adding all this extra stuff that you don't need anymore? Just because of the fact that it fits your situation a little bit better. Or that it makes other people have to come into your own situation to begin with. Which, if you want to be a part of the Bible study, you can still do that.
There's still time.
Patreon.com/Ministry Misfits. If you want to join the Bible study, we just finished recording week 7 of a 6-chapter book.
Go figure.
And we're just now getting into the beginning part of chapter 5. So there's going to be at least probably 3 or 4 more weeks of this. We'll probably be done, by birthday month. Hopefully we'll be done by birthday month. If you want to join that, patreon.com/Ministry Misfits, it gets you access to all the videos and all the study guides and all the good stuff there, as well as the discussions and the comments that we're having. So patreon.com/Ministry Misfits. You can join that. You also get access to the other different stuff depending on the level that you join at. But the $3 level gets you access to the Bible studies itself as well. So Patreon, go join that if you want to join the Bible study. Again, like Brandon said at the beginning, we also got the merch store back up on the website. It was down for a day while I was trying to get everything figured out again. But we've got some new items, the 90s kid flashback stuff, the Misfit Paul stuff, as well as some other just general Misfit items are all up. All the Tikva stuff is still up as well. You'll also notice with some of the older items that the prices are a little bit lower now. We were able to find a way to lower the prices and to make all the prices somewhat more uniform. That also help with a little bit more of the shipping, since shipping costs have all gone up and everything like that. So the prices are a little bit different. Most of them are lower. I think the mugs may be a little bit more, but that's to help with shipping, things like that. So go to the Misfits website, go to the shop link, and you'll be able to find all the goodies there as well. Some other updates going on with the website that are hopefully going to be done soon because it's getting very long. I forgot how many guests we actually had when I decided to start doing the new guest portal. I think we're at 35
website.
I'm pretty sure we're at 35 was my account, but we also know my math can't be trusted. So who knows how many we've actually had. We've had at least 35.
It's starting to look like its own social media page.
Yeah, it is basically. And that's it actually is going to be a little bit easier to navigate once we're done with all of this. But that is coming, as well as it'll also be easier to find people's books and other podcasts and things like that once we're done with all of it. So that's coming. It's still being worked on. We're almost done. We have a few new guests that we're going to be adding here soon, assuming that we can get schedules worked out here for season 3. We've got some different topics. Some of the topics even dealing with the empathy side of what we were talking about today. So Brandon, hopefully we're going to be back together next week.
Yeah, hopefully
no
in
more
person.
Bugs attacking, both physical bugs and illness bugs, both. So everybody else, we'll see you next week.
The Ministry Misfits podcast is a production of Ministry Misfit Media in association with Overwhelming Victory. Dr. Greg Linville and Andrew Fouts are our executive producers, and Brandon Simmons is associate producer. The Ministry Misfits theme song is written and produced by J.D. Laird and Laird Creative Agency. If you would like to get in touch with us, you can email us at ministrymisfitmedia@gmail.com or by following @ministrymisfit on Facebook, Twitter, Instagram, and TikTok. You can also visit our website at www.ministrymisfits.com or through bio.link/ministrymisfits. If you would like to support Ministry Misfits, you can become a patron by going to patreon.com/Ministry Misfits.